Question number 1. What is your name and what is your role in the menstrual activism space?
Hi, my name is Anusha Singh, and I'm a menstrual equity activist. I was formerly the national campaign lead at Period and the community and social impact specialist at AntFlow. But now I'm getting ready to go to medical school and hopefully continue my menstrual equity advocacy there.
And when did you first get involved in the menstrual activism space?
I started my Period chapter in 2018. So around my freshman year of college, going to sophomore year, that's when I started my Period chapter, but that's when I realized that I'm already part of the movement, just by talking about menstrual health and just destigmatizing periods. That's something that we've been doing, something I've been doing my whole life ever since I learned about it, and just questioning, like, why is this a thing? So, ever since then, but yes, technically.
And what is the biggest challenge you faced so far, personally speaking?
In the menstrual movement, would you say?
Just as an activist.
As an activist. I think one of the biggest challenges I faced so far as an activist is people not taking menstrual equity activism seriously and not realizing, the far-reaching implications, the negative implications of period stigma in society. It affects everyone and global development as a whole, because it's so intersectional, this issue, and I think a lot of times people don't think of it as a real issue just because it's not as widely discussed. So I think the lack of taking it seriously, honestly, as seriously as people should be, I think that's the biggest thing.
Yeah. And in this space, as a whole, what is the biggest problem we faced?
Yeah, I would say along those lines, people not willing to talk about periods. I think that holds back conversations that need to be had to progress, menstrual equity, and to, advocate for marginalized groups and ensure that they have access to essential items like period products, and acknowledge that this disproportionately affects a lot of these lower income and marginalized communities. So I think by not discussing it, it affects so many people, more than half our population, but also by holding back menstruators from reaching their full potential, that affects everybody on a larger scale. So yeah, I would say period stigma.
And we've noted that you've done a lot of work in the space of legislation as related to reproductive justice. So I'm going to ask you a few questions about that. In this day and age, can you evaluate the efficacy of social media and technology as a resource to amend state or national law?
Social media is so valuable in spreading awareness about how, especially youth, can be involved in advocating for the passage of legislation. I think, and I've seen this firsthand, legislators being so surprised because the legislative process is designed to have barriers, for people to make their voice heard. For example, when you hear about an opportunity to testify, oftentimes they only give 1 to 2 day notice, and that's barely anything, and that leaves out so many important voices out of the conversation. And something that I was passionate about, for example, was ensuring that every young person especially can make their voices heard and know about opportunities to testify in their state. For example, if there's menstrual equity legislation that's introduced or it's going to be voted on, right? And I think, for example, in Michigan recently, that was one of the states I most recently worked on to help pass legislation there and, organize around it and work with so many amazing advocates in Michigan. It was to repeal the tampon tax there. It took 10 years since it was first introduced for it to pass, but something that I was so impressed by was how many young people were willing to, within 1 to 2 day notice, submit testimony to lawmakers. And I think within a couple of days, people submitted over 70 testimony, more than 70 students, and lawmakers even talked about that during the actual hearing. They were really amazed by the passion and how many people care about this issue. And we were able to spread the word through social media. We were able to create toolkits, and young people, really high school students, just like yourself, were literally instrumental in this. Teaching others how to testify, taking this toolkit, presenting it to their classes, and it just really amazed me too about like how instrumental social media is, and also how well young people are able to use it to get messages across in a way that really helps further activism too. So
Yeah, I agree. And that's absolutely crazy. That's amazing. How do the makeups of legislative bodies and entities need to change so that the policies they pass are more equitable?
Yeah, the makeup of legislative bodies totally needs to change, because I can tell you, when I first testified to repeal the Ohio tampon tax, when I mentioned the word period on the House floor, I am not kidding you when I say there were, like, first of all, I was testifying from a committee of about 20 members, 17 men, and just 3 women, maybe just 1 woman of color, right? And that whole committee. And when I mentioned the word period on the House floor there, I got so many looks, like so many disturbed looks from lawmakers. They were totally embarrassed to be talking about such a natural issue. And I could tell that they instantly like turned, they were not hearing anything after that. Like many of them, some of them even rolled their eyes at me from across the room, totally just not taking this issue seriously at all. And, it's probably due to several reasons, them being non-menstruators, but also, because of the stigma around periods, they don't want to talk about the issue. And how do we pass legislation that's equitable if we're not even willing to talk about periods, right? If we, how do we pass menstrual equity legislation when lawmakers roll their eyes at you when you say the word period,
Yeah.
Right. I think it's so important that they're able to talk about it. And a huge change would happen if we had more menstruators, in office, and that representation there. I think that's huge.
Yes. And completely related to that, in what way can we change or modify our conversation so that it is impactful with people who may be reluctant to listen?
That's a really good question. I will say something in my advocacy experience that has worked is meeting people where they're at. I know it's like difficult sometimes, especially for me, when I started the period chapter at my school at the Ohio State University. And, it was very normal for me after a certain point to talk about periods openly. And I realized I was kind of in a bubble. And it wasn't until I started speaking to lawmakers, predominantly like older white men who do not talk about this issue at all, I realized I need to change the way, like language is so crucial in advocacy. And I realized that if I want to get my point across, I need to meet them where they're at. I also need to make sure when I talk about this issue, it's relatable to them because they don't menstruate. So a lot of times we would use tactics in our language. We would introduce ourselves not just as a student and an activist, but also as a daughter. And they probably have daughters, or they probably have sisters that they care for who menstruate, who are impacted by these inequitable policies. By relating to them in that way, I think that was one way that we were able to win their support. I think ultimately it's not something that happens like overnight. I think it takes a lot of normalizing, a lot of cultural change, holding rallies over a period of time, consistently lobbying lawmakers and showing that how much grassroots power there is for a cause, putting that public pressure on them. So, there were definitely reluctant lawmakers still, but we were able to pressure them to also support it. I've learned a lot about that, also how to appeal to their interests. I hope I answered your question though.
Yeah, no, it's definitely just flipping the script so they're accountable for what they say, because then it directly affects them.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so when we talk about these large-scale campaigns to make a difference, how do you evaluate the impact?
I think the biggest thing that we look for is, in addition to creating change, is realizing that campaigns, it's not just one person who can accomplish everything themselves in a campaign. It's about other people, empowering other people to also campaign in their local communities and kind of champion this issue in their states and their cities, and giving them the tools to do that. So maybe that's, informing them about times to testify, or maybe it's about, I previously led a policy boot camp period that was really fun, where the whole goal was to give activists the tools to advocate for this cause, whether that's, how to write a letter to the editor, or, different ways to basically make your voices heard, organizing press conferences, lobbying lawmakers, things like that. But I think by empowering and supporting other youth leaders and, giving them the platform to advocate for this as well, grassroots leaders, I think that's a huge way we measure impact. And I, especially like on a personal level, measure impact. Like, my goal is not to do everything myself, because I know like this takes a group of people, this cause, we need a lot of voices, and we really need to show that grassroots support for it. People need to acknowledge it's a real issue, just like, other widely spoken about issues like food insecurity, for example. So it's gonna take a lot of voices.
Yeah, no, that's a really good answer. Another thing I'll ask you specifically, because you do so much research, you're studying to be a doctor, how does science influence our legislation, and how important is it for lawmakers to have some science background?
That is a really good question. Actually, I really feel strongly about it too, that in the future, I want to practice medicine, but I also think it's so important to advocate on, behalf of patients you see in the clinic, right? Using the stories you hear from them to learn about different injustices that they face, and advocate on behalf of them to lawmakers and inform them about the impact that these policies have on patients on different levels. Because I think, clinical medicine only goes so far without advocacy. I saw this like really wonderful quote the other day about that, about how all physicians need to be advocates, right? Like we all need to, like, especially in today's day and age with Roe v. Wade and everything, restricting a lot of, especially OBGYN doctors from they're practicing their full scope of practice. Like they've been trained to perform abortion care, and it's unfortunate that lawmakers who have no idea about medicine are kind of telling doctors on how to practice medicine and restricting without having knowledge about the implications of this issue, restricting it. And I think that's kind of scary for the medical profession. So I definitely think that we need more representation of medical professionals in the policy-making space. We definitely have advocacy groups, but I think there needs to be more of an effort and emphasis on this in medical school curriculums too, beyond the sciences. How do you make your voices heard? Because I think, because we go through such a lengthy training, with medical school, residency, there's a lot of, expertise that comes with that I think would help benefit lawmakers too and their decision-making process, whether it's, directly running for office. I know some physicians who are literally elected officials as well, but or, just having an organizing or advocacy group where you meet with lawmakers to advocate for health equity policies. But I think that is so important. And currently, I don't think there is enough emphasis on it, but I think our generation is really challenging that. And hopefully the next generation, and I know the next generation of doctors will definitely be more outspoken about it and recognize this responsibility too,
Yeah. And I was looking over these questions on June 24th when Roe v. Wade was overturned. And I'll tell you frankly, as a young person, as a menstruating person, as somebody who knows a lot of menstruating people, I was scared. So in a very, very scary scheme of legislature, when people are being denied healthcare, how can people feel less helpless?
Oh my gosh, when people are being denied healthcare, it's honestly very tough. I really, really empathize with the people who are in red states where trigger laws have already, gone into effect. It's, I also watched this video the other day, and I think it's so true, that because of lack of awareness about how the menstrual cycle works, and when it comes to some of this abortion legislation, a lot of it is super impractical. A lot of people don't even realize that they're pregnant before it's too late, and it's not possible for them to even get an abortion. But that's how restrictive these policies are, and it's all because lawmakers don't understand menstrual cycles, and that's why we need physicians and we need scientists involved in policy. But I understand the feeling of hopelessness, but I think at this time, I'm definitely not like a physician who can like give advice like that, but I know quite a few outspoken physician advocates who've offered plans of like how people can take control of their own reproductive future. So, including birth control plans and things like that. But in terms of like, that's like an immediate plan for like right now. But this is definitely the long game when it comes to advocacy. I think that people need to continue when there are opportunities to testify in your state on this legislation, submit testimony for it, make your voices heard, meet with your lawmakers, and take this, anger towards this inequitable policy to the polls. The health of menstruators is always on the ballot so we need to really take that into account when we're choosing our elected officials, like, choosing people who are, pro-choice, who support menstrual equity even, because I think it's very related. They're both about increased autonomy and increased agency over reproductive care. So we need lawmakers to support this. So we need to vote and make sure that people even from low-income marginalized communities have access, are aware about these voting deadlines and can also vote.
Yeah. And for people who may not have it in their hands to vote quite yet, how can younger people get involved?
One way to make your, to pressure your elected officials is like, especially if you're a constituent of their district, is by voting. And I think that's why lawmakers especially listen to constituents, because they have voting power. But say you're not eligible to vote yet, I think you can still make your voice heard. You may have people around you who are voting age, for example. So you have the power to influence people, even if you're young. I saw this really inspiring video of like this 13-year-old student on TikTok the other day who very powerfully spoke on, advocated on behalf of another issue in front of a room full of elected officials. And she said, I may not have the power to vote, but her voice held so much power. The points she made were so articulate. She had the ability to influence people in that room. And I think even if you're young and you can't vote, technically you can still influence, people around you who can to vote. And I think that is incredible. And also like, these days I feel like I have younger, cousins who are, in the 6th grade. They have social media now, and it's amazing that people, especially young people, are able to make their voices heard through platforms like this. For National Period Day, I worked with one organizer who was only 13 years old. She organized her first rally, as a middle school student with her elected officials, and brought people together with hundreds of people there in attendance and in Indiana. And I just remember being so amazed by that, seeing that even as a middle school student who can't, she can't vote, but she was able to make her voice heard in a different way by mobilizing people and organizing around this issue. So that's another way you can make your voice heard.
Yeah. And when you were a young person, what was something you wish you knew about menstruation and or reproductive justice?
I think about menstruation, it would be helpful to know what a normal period is supposed to be like. I think that's a very common question that a lot of young people face, and I think I didn't realize it until, shadowing a physician that I worked on a clinical research project with this past year about periods, and especially period poverty, how it disproportionately affects menstruators with bleeding disorders, so like endometriosis, and who have more abnormal bleeding, and what is normal and what is not normal. A lot of times we have young people coming into the clinic and they ask the physician I'm shadowing questions like, oh, is my period even normal? But most likely if they're there, it's for a reason, and it's not. But at the same time, more widespread education about that, I think that would be amazing. And maybe not necessarily alongside sex ed. Maybe it's like before. I think it has to be introduced at a way earlier age. Not high school. I'm talking like, and not in gender segregated classrooms where it's like made to be talked about in secrecy as if it's something to be ashamed of, but like in a normal environment as part of like a standard curriculum across all schools. And super early, because these days menstruators are getting their periods as early as like the 3rd, 4th grade. So we need this like way sooner. And also menstrual disorders is something that I wish was incorporated in menstrual health curriculums. Because way too often, like people are not aware about disorders like endometriosis until it's way too late, or fibroids and things like a bunch of menstrual disorder issues. So definitely important topics.
And what does the word stigma mean to you?
Stigma. What stigma means to me is taking the power away from somebody to openly articulate and talk about issues. Taking that vocabulary away from them to be able to confidently talk about issues and leading to some sort of impact, like a negative impact. So, when you deny someone the vocabulary to talk about an issue, when you shame them, I think that's a tactic to oppress people. That is a tactic to prevent issues. By preventing issues from even being discussed, that is a tool, especially when it comes to issues like menstrual health and reproductive health. It's a tool to oppress, in those cases, more than half the population, also affecting, members of the LGBTQ plus community and disproportionately affecting those groups and other marginalized groups. But by denying menstruators the vocabulary to openly talk about periods in a way that they're not shamed for it, I think that holds us all back from, menstrual equity. It holds us back from, so many, I could go on, but yeah, it just holds us back, like everyone.
Yeah. As we're easing off, question number 14 is, do you have any particularly entertaining life stories pertaining to your period?
Oh my gosh, that's so funny. I would say, I think most of them are mostly I think of traumatic experiences when I got my period and I didn't have access to period products. But apart from that, I guess when I first got my period, I was I think it was the 6th grade. I was living in India at the time because I moved there to Mumbai. And I was not aware that I had gotten my period for some reason because the shade was not what I envisioned it to be. I honestly thought I crapped myself because I was like, this is not, I had no idea what a normal period was like. And so for the longest time, I was so embarrassed about that. I didn't tell anyone. And I'm like, oh, and then I realized, oh, this is a menstrual cycle. So goes back to, why education around periods is so important.
Yeah. Yes.
I know. I was like, what is happening? Why am I, 12 years old and crapping my bed all of a sudden? Like, what is this about?
Oh my God, that must have been terrifying. All right. 15th question to our viewers. What is your words of wisdom?
My words of wisdom. If you're listening to this, or if you're someone who, actively likes to talk about periods and also, without shame, without embarrassment, you're already part of the menstrual movement. I think it's important, it's not a whole new movement you have to join. And also if you care about other issues, whether it's racial justice, economic justice, or, food insecurity, I don't know, there's so many out there, climate justice, they're all in some way related to menstrual equity. And by caring about those issues, you are also already part of the menstrual movement, because I think a huge misconception is that period poverty, lack of access to period products, and period stigma, these are very isolated issues in their own bucket, but really it's a vehicle to, or it's it's an important part of achieving gender equality. So I think, my advice would be to recognize that you're already part of the menstrual movement. And now it's about being, brave enough to talk about these issues with lawmakers and with people on social media and drive that cultural change that we need to pass more equitable policies. Because by changing culture, that's the only way we're going to see more equitable menstrual policies. that's how we're going to change the minds of lawmakers, and that's how we're going to elect more menstruators into office who want to champion these issues, including non-menstruators. It's by talking about this conversation or talking about periods with friends, coworkers, lawmakers, honestly, everybody. And when you see a place, when you recognize, oh my gosh, this is a building that does not have access to period products, maybe it's your local library, maybe you choose to, advocate for that and meet with the librarian at your library. For example, like that's a very small, that's just one example, but there's so many different ways you can make your voice heard, and it could be as simple as just talking about menstrual health and periods.